In October 69 BCE, on the arid plains outside the newly built capital of Tigranocerta, a Roman army of roughly 15,000 men stared down an imperial host nearly 6 times their size. The Roman commander, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, had marched his legions deep into the Armenian highlands to face Tigranes the Great, whose forces numbered between 80,000 and 100,000 troops. Surveying the harsh sunlight glinting off the sprawling vastness of his own camp, which sharply contrasted with the small silent blocks of Roman cohorts, the Armenian king openly mocked his enemy. He famously declared that if the Romans came as ambassadors, they were too many, but if they came as an army, they were far too few. This supreme arrogance would shortly cost him his empire. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the Battle of Tigranocerta, now where Roman discipline and a single brilliant flanking maneuver turned a massive numerical advantage into a lethal crush. We will analyze the precise command decisions and tactical shifts that orchestrated one of the most stunning underdog victories in ancient military history. To understand how a Roman army found itself so dangerously isolated, one must look to the relentless exhaustion of the Third Mithridatic War. For years, the Republic had bled wealth and manpower, attempting to crush Mithridates, the sixth of Pontus, Rome's most persistent eastern rival. Following a series of catastrophic defeats, the Pontic king abandoned his shattered realm and sought refuge at the court of his son-in-law, Tigranes the Great. Unlike the fractured kingdoms Rome usually pacified, Armenia under Tigranes was a sprawling ascendant superpower. He had carved territory from the Parthian Empire and swallowed the remnants of the Seleucid realm, crowning himself the King of Kings. To cross his borders was to declare war on an established wealthy state capable of mobilizing unimaginable resources. Yet, Lucius Licinius Lucullus refused to let his quarry escape. Operating far beyond his official mandate, the Roman commander made the unprecedented decision to invade Armenia unprovoked. It was a staggering political and military gamble. By marching his regular troops across the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers without explicit approval from the Senate, Lucullus staked his entire career and his life on absolute victory. His logistics were stretched to the breaking point. The deeper the legions advanced into the rugged, unfamiliar terrain, the more precarious their survival became, and the march itself was an agonizing test of discipline. As they pushed through the mountainous interior, the harsh, arid dust of the Armenian highlands choked the air, relentlessly wearing down the legionaries' leather straps and iron armor. Every mile marched was a mile further from reliable supply depots, friendly allies, or any hope of reinforcement. The political factions back in Rome remained largely unaware of the immense peril their commander had embraced. Lucullus had dragged his legions to the absolute edge of the known world, but finding the enemy was only the first problem. Surviving their counterattack would be entirely another. Rather than wander aimlessly through hostile territory, hunting highly mobile Armenian cavalry, Lucullus aimed his spear directly at the enemy's pride, Tigranocerta. This was not merely a fortress. It was the newly minted capital of the empire, a sprawling monument to the King of Kings populated by forcefully relocated Greeks, Cappadocians, and Cilicians who held little genuine loyalty to their Armenian overlord. Lucullus understood a fundamental law of ancient warfare. To force a pitched battle against a superior, swift-moving foe, one must threaten a fixed position the enemy cannot afford to abandon. Chasing Tigranes across the vast steppes would slowly bleed the legions to death through attrition and severed supply lines. By encircling the capital, the Roman commander effectively dictated the location and terms of the coming engagement. The legions immediately began the grueling work of investment. They choked off the city with meticulously dug trenches and imposing timber palisades, their rigid discipline transforming the rugged frontier into a highly structured military perimeter, sitting defiant outside the towering stone walls of the capital. The rhythmic, heavy thud of Roman entrenching tools striking the hard earth served as a constant psychological pressure on the defenders. This ring of earthworks was less about starving the trapped inhabitants and entirely about baiting a strategic trap. The political pressure on Tigranes was absolute. He could not allow a vastly smaller foreign army to strangle his namesake city while he watched from safety. To do so would shatter his imperial prestige and invite immediate rebellion among his recently conquered vassals. The bait worked perfectly, drawing the King of Kings out of the mountains with a massive host. But Lucullus was about to realize exactly what he had summoned. The host that materialized on the horizon was a testament to the staggering resources of the Armenian Empire. Tigranes had assembled an army numbering between 80,000 and 100,000 troops, drawing tens of thousands of archers, slingers, and infantry levies from every corner of his dominion. However, the true threat lay in the vanguard, the Cataphracts. These were the elite shock cavalry of the East, where both rider and horse were entirely encased in overlapping iron scale and chainmail. They formed a wall of gleaming iron, reflecting the harsh Near Eastern sun, an intimidating metallic mass designed to physically and psychologically shatter any infantry line before close quarters combat even began. And standing against this imperial juggernaut was a Roman force of roughly 15,000 men, built around a hardened core of the Fimbrian legions. These were deeply cynical, politically volatile, yet highly lethal veterans who had fought relentlessly through years of the Mithridatic wars. Their survival was defined by an ironclad discipline that stripped all panic from the battlefield. The upcoming clash presented a stark technological and tactical paradox. The Armenian commanders intended to use their heavy cavalry as a blunt instrument, relying on sheer, unstoppable forward momentum and impenetrable frontal armor to run down their opponents. The Romans, conversely, depended on the precise checkerboard spacing of their cohort formations to absorb shock. The shield-piercing disruption caused by volleys of the heavy pilum and the brutal, or grinding efficiency of the short gladius in tight melee. If permitted a direct head-on collision across a flat plain, the physical weight of the Armenian Cataphracts would inevitably pulverize the Roman infantry. A legionary shield wall, no matter how resolute, could not mathematically withstand the kinetic energy of thousands of heavily armored war horses striking simultaneously at full gallop. Lucullus recognized that if he allowed Tigranes to dictate the angle of engagement, his expeditionary force would be entirely erased. Therefore, the Romans had to leverage their only true advantage, the structural flexibility of their command. While the Armenian lines were rigid and difficult to steer once set in motion, Roman centurions could autonomously pivot their smaller units, exploiting the slightest terrain irregularities to disrupt an enemy advance. To the naked eye, the Romans were hopelessly outmatched, but the Armenian commanders failed to notice one critical flaw in their own deployment. Between the vast Armenian host and the entrenched Roman legions flowed a shallow but fast-moving river, serving as a natural barrier across the theater of operations. Rather than holding his fortified position or waiting for the superior enemy force to envelop his lines, Lucullus seized the initiative. He ordered his cohorts to form columns and march parallel to the riverbank, actively searching for a fordable crossing. From his elevated command position, Tigranes observed the Roman vanguard moving laterally, away from the direct line of confrontation. In viewing the maneuver through the lens of his immense numerical superiority, the King of Kings concluded that the Romans had recognized the futility of their situation and were attempting an orderly retreat. This premature assumption of victory fundamentally relaxed the posture of the Armenian army, a fatal psychological error that left their formations static and unprepared for sudden aggression. The Romans, however, were executing a highly calculated assault under the enemy's nose. Upon reaching a bend where the waters widened and the depth dropped, Lucullus abruptly wheeled his forces toward the opposite bank. Without breaking their interlocking structure, the legionaries waded directly into the cold, rushing water. Their large rectangular shields raised defensively against potential archer fire. The crossing was an absolute display of veteran discipline. Thousands of armed men traversed the riverbed in near-complete silence, maintaining precise tactical alignment against the current. The Armenian command structure, suddenly confronted with an organized advance rather than a fleeing enemy, failed to mobilize their heavy cavalry quickly enough to contest the landing. By the time the legionaries stepped onto dry land, they had successfully closed the distance without suffering a single casualty, effectively securing a foothold directly across from the Imperial host. Tigranes realized too late that the Romans were not retreating. They were crossing the water to bring the fight to his doorstep, and they were aiming for the weakest point on the field. The Armenian heavy cavalry, the absolute core of Tigranes' military strength, now was massed tightly at the base of a low, seemingly insignificant hill. On a flat, open plain, their unified charge would be an unstoppable kinetic event. However, positioned closely against the incline to anchor their flank, they were strategically compromised. Their immense physical weight, combined with the dense overlapping iron scale of their armor, meant they possessed virtually zero rotational agility. A cataphract formation could only drive straight forward. Lucullus recognized instantly that the topography itself was the key to dismantling the armored wall. The hill was not merely an obstacle. Whoever controlled its elevation controlled the gravitational momentum of the entire engagement. Rather than ordering a suicidal frontal assault against the ironclad line, the Roman commander executed a precise, localized flanking maneuver. Stripping off his heavy, ornate general's cloak so his standard tunic would serve as a highly visible, unmistakable focal point for his troops, Lucullus personally detached 2 veteran cohorts from the main infantry body. Moving with the aggressive, silent efficiency characteristic of Roman veterans, this detachment advanced rapidly toward the unguarded incline, slipping behind the flank of the static Armenian cavalry. The Cataphracts, locked shoulder to shoulder in their forward-facing deployment, were structurally incapable of pivoting their massive, heavily burdened warhorses fast enough to intercept the moving legionaries. The Roman cohorts crested the summit without facing any meaningful resistance from the disorganized Armenian command structure. From this elevated vantage point, the lethal vulnerability of Tigranes' elite forces was laid completely bare. While the Cataphracts were an impenetrable fortress from the front, their armor was engineered exclusively for head-on collisions. The rear quarters of their mounts, as well as the riders' backs, were entirely exposed. The Romans now held the definitive high ground, possessing both the angle and the gravitational advantage required to turn the enemy's own immense mass into a fatal liability. The tactical trap had been perfectly executed. The invincible iron wall was functionally neutralized before a single pilum was thrown. Standing at the crest of the hill, looking down at the unarmored rears of the enemy horses, Lucullus gave the order that would shatter an empire. The Roman cohorts surged down the incline, and converting their gravitational advantage into overwhelming kinetic momentum. As they closed the final yards, Lucullus issued a highly specific, unprecedented tactical command. Ignore the armored riders entirely. Striking at the thick, overlapping iron scales of the Cataphracts would only blunt Roman blades and exhaust the infantry to no strategic benefit. Instead, the centurions directed their men to target the only exposed vulnerabilities in the enemy's deployment: the unarmored lower legs and underbellies of the heavy warhorses. The legionaries maintained their rigid interlocking structure, using their large rectangular shields to deflect any panicked retaliatory strikes, while deploying the short gladius not for hacking, but for precise, upward thrusts directly into muscle and tendon, and stripped of their forward mobility and structural integrity, the elite vanguard immediately buckled. The physical pressure at the base of the hill became absolute as massive war horses, hamstrung by Roman iron, collapsed catastrophically under the tremendous weight of their own armor. A deafening cacophony of shrieking animals and crushing metal dominated the narrow space as hundreds of elite riders were pinned beneath their dying mounts, completely unable to leverage their long lances or even stand up in the dirt. The tightly packed ranks of the Armenian cavalry, engineered to be an unstoppable force in a straight frontal charge, now acted as a fatal, inescapable trap. Those in the middle and rear echelons could not pivot their heavy mounts to face the Roman flank attack, nor could they back away without trampling their own comrades. Unmitigated panic rapidly superseded whatever remained of Tigranes' military discipline. Command and control within the Armenian vanguard evaporated in a matter of minutes under the relentless, methodical advance of the cohorts. The surviving Cataphracts riders, desperate to avoid the systematic dismantling of their lines, instinctively spurred their unbroken horses away from the Roman blades. Rather than attempting to form a defensive rearguard or wheeling around to stabilize the flank, the elite shock troops shattered their own formation completely and initiated a blind, full-scale rout directly backward across the plains. But the destruction of the heavy cavalry was only the beginning. Their frantic attempt to escape would unleash an even greater disaster upon their own army. The surviving Cataphracts, desperately fleeing the downhill Roman assault, had nowhere to retreat except directly into the densely packed lines of their own infantry. The massive scale of Tigranes' 80,000-strong army, previously its greatest strategic asset, instantly inverted into its most fatal vulnerability. The Armenian infantry levies, drawn up in deep, rigid formations to project overwhelming numerical dominance, possessed absolutely no spatial capacity to absorb or safely part for a panicked cavalry retreat. Thousands of frantic, heavily armored war horses plowed blindly into the unarmored human ranks, structurally shattering the army's cohesion from the inside out before the legionaries even made contact with the main body. The Roman cohorts did not need to execute further complex maneuvers to exploit this catastrophic collapse. They simply maintained their interlocking shield walls and advanced at a steady, methodical marching pace into the unfolding chaos. The engagement immediately ceased to be a tactical contest and devolved into a systemic execution. The Armenian soldiers were trapped in a fatal geographic crush, entirely unable to raise their weapons, form a defensive perimeter, or escape. The sheer density of their own stampeding comrades physically pinned them in place, turning the vast plain into an inescapable bottleneck. The veteran legionaries functioned with the cold, unyielding efficiency of a military machine, pressing forward strictly to cut down a disorganized enemy that was already actively destroying itself. The final casualty disparity starkly reflected the brutal reality of this asymmetrical tactical breakdown. While historical records indicate that Armenian losses numbered in the tens of thousands, a staggering demographic catastrophe as the grand host was effectively erased in a single afternoon. Conversely, Roman casualties were shockingly negligible, estimated by chroniclers at mere hundreds of wounded and dead. The King of Kings, watching the absolute disintegration of his imperial authority from his command position, was forced into a sudden, humiliating flight to avoid capture. Tigranes himself barely escaped with his life, abandoning his royal diadem and his besieged capital, leaving the Romans to claim a prize of unimaginable wealth. That unimaginable wealth lay directly behind the stone walls of his eponymous capital. Deprived of their emperor and witnessing the absolute annihilation of the relief force on the plains below, the foreign mercenaries guarding Tigranocerta mutinied and opened the massive gates to the Romans. The subsequent sack yielded a staggering accumulation of imperial treasure. Lucullus, seized an estimated 8,000 talents of coined money and distributed a massive bounty of 800 drachmae to each of his legionaries, with the heavy metallic clinking of looted silver becoming the defining sound of the campaign's climax. Yet, this unprecedented influx of plunder would paradoxically sow the seeds of the Roman commander's own undoing. Despite executing one of the most brilliant tactical victories in antiquity, Lucullus was fundamentally incapable of securing the political loyalty of his own men or the Senate back in Rome. His aristocratic austerity and strict demands for relentless marching bred deep resentment among the Fimbrian legions, who were exhausted by years of unauthorized, grueling campaigns. Mutinies soon paralyzed the Roman advance, preventing Lucullus from fully subjugating the Armenian Empire. His political enemies in the capital capitalized on this stagnation, successfully stripping him of his command and replacing him with his ambitious rival, Pompey the Great, who would ultimately reap the glory of finalizing the eastern conquests. Lucullus had won the battlefield, but decisively lost the political war. The Battle of Tigranocerta remains a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare, proving definitively that strict discipline, superior terrain analysis, and tactical agility can completely dismantle absurd numerical disadvantages. It stands as a stark reminder that sheer mass is useless without the structural integrity to wield it. If you want to explore more chapters where brilliant strategy defied impossible odds, subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together. History favors not the largest army, but the most disciplined mind.